Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome you all to the Research, Reflection and Practices Forum. This is our guest lecture series that we do. It's actually an internal learning process. But this time, since your topic was interesting, we thought and relevant to Sri Lanka, we thought we'll make it open forum. So we have a few who have joined online, and we're expecting a few more here. So welcome, Dr. Derek Hurdy, once again. The modality of today's lecture is actually, so you will be presenting, which is followed by Professor Himatsiri Kutagama doing a little moderation and commentary on your work. And just to briefly introduce, first the moderator, Professor Kutagama, is a senior economist at CEPA and is the team leader of the thematic basic services and protection. His expertise is in development economics and policy and sustainable development. He also had very extensive teaching career prior to joining CEPA. He was at the University of Peradeniya and was in Oman at the Sultan Qaboos University. So he will be taking up the session after you present. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Derek Hurdy to the audience. He is a senior research fellow in the Development Strategies and Governance Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute. And his research interests are economic development, nutrition, and agriculture. He's a development economist. His research focus is on the links between agricultural development, poverty, and nutrition. He has been the principal investigator for the Advancing Research on Nutrition and Agriculture project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He has worked on agriculture and nutrition projects for US aid in Ethiopia and Myanmar. I still believe he's working in Myanmar too, for the BMGF Foundation in Burkina Faso, and for NIFID and FCDO in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. So we can see that he has a lot of experience and knowledge in the South Asia region, and we look forward to your very interesting presentation. So he has also co-authored a widely cited book on the global food crisis named Reflections on the Global Food Crisis with Sheng and Fan in 2010, published by IFPRI. And he has a lot of peer-reviewed articles in very well-known journals in various different thematics, general sciences, in the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, in public health and nutrition, the Lancet Global Health, the Journal of Nutrition, American Journal of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, in economics, agriculture and social science, in demography, American Journal of Agricultural Economics, Annual Review of Resource Economics, Agricultural Economics, World Bank Economics Review, World Development, the Journal of Development Studies, and many more. Academia, so he's a University of Queensland product with a Bachelor's of Economics honors with the first class and PhD in Economics. So I warmly welcome Dr. Derek Hurdy to talk about nutrition as a basic need, a new method for utility, consistent and nutritionally adequate food lines. Over to you.
Yeah, while the slides are loading, just thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here. This is actually, I used to, in my PhD, used to work for a Center for Efficiency and Productivity Analysis, so another CEPA. So this is my second CEPA, but it's good to be here. I do find poverty more interesting than efficiency and productivity analysis, so that's good. So yeah, as was said, this is a paper called Nutrition as a Basic Need, a new method for utility, consistent and nutritionally adequate food poverty lines. There's a long list of co-authors. Christy Mart, who works with me at IFPRI, was sort of the main technician behind this. Anna Herforth is a well-known nutritionist with a lot of expertise in food-based dietary guidelines and dietary metrics. Sherman Robinson is actually a very famous modeler, one of the founders of CG models in economics with Irma Edelman, and is a sort of honorary research fellow at IFPRI. Channing Arndt is a senior director at IFPRI in the CGR as well. And yeah, so some very smart people on this paper. And I should add a caveat that I didn't do much of the technical side on the paper. There's some fairly fancy econometrics in here that was mostly done by Christy and Channing. If I click this, okay. So a quick outline, I'll just make some introductory remarks, go a little bit into the history of nutrition and poverty lines and how we define healthy, nutritious diets and the specific motivations and contributions for our new approach. Then I'll go into the concepts and methods of our approach. And then we apply this to Myanmar, but the paper is not really about Myanmar. We just took Myanmar data because we were working with it. And we're very confident that some of the main findings would extrapolate to any low and middle income country, including Sri Lanka. I'll go into that, why that's the case. And then I'll just have a very brief discussion. I look forward to remarks and questions. So how we think about basic needs for nutrition is really at the heart of how we measure poverty and food insecurity, and it always has been. So before modern poverty measurement, of course, you can go back to Engel and others, these economists in the 1800s and early 1900s, and they were very much defining poverty in terms of things like, what's enough calories to do your job in a factory in Manchester, England in 1864. In fact, there was even one paper in early 1900s where this economist went and consulted a bunch of doctors and said, well, actually, apart from calories, what else do people need? And nutrition was not very developed then. But he actually defined a sort of basic needs nutrition poverty line that was more than just calories. The work we're presenting today tries to align kind of three obviously related concepts, and that's basic nutritional needs, food security, and poverty measurement. And we're going to start by going back roughly 50 years to understand the origins of the norms that we still use today, at least in poverty measurement. So 50 years ago, really, the available data very much defined the problems, at least the problems in terms of nutrition and food security, and then relatedly poverty measurement. So prevalence of undernutrition, such as the FAO measure, was from food supply data. There really were very few nutrition surveys back in the 50s and 60s, especially national surveys. There wasn't really much development in terms of anthropometry, in terms of stunting and wasting. And people, especially economists, used to use these terms interchangeably. Sort of undernutrition meant calorie undernutrition. And that was how we talked for a long time. In fact, that was, even when I first started working in nutrition, that was still true, I think, in many places. And then nutrition sciences, interestingly, in the 50s and 60s, they used to talk about protein calorie deficiency. And there was quite a bit of talk about diet quality in terms of protein quality. And then that kind of disappeared around 1970 when there was a famous article in The Lancet by a nutritionist who said, well, you're not going to have protein deficiency if you have calorie adequacy. So that just shifted more focus onto calories rather than even proteins. And, in practically speaking, people didn't talk much about micronutrients. In terms of food security, the definition from the World Food Summit in 1974 was availability at all times of adequate world food supplies. So actually, they didn't even talk about country food supplies. So it very much wasn't defined at the household or individual level. And so that's quite different. And then in 1973, the CGIAR, who I worked for, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, was sort of formed or formalized. And that's the global agricultural R&D and infrastructure. But that was very much structured around centers that focused on productivity of major staple crops. So that's like IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute, and CIMMYT that focuses on maize and wheat. And then other centers came along, but it's all basically staple crops and then later a bit of livestock and fish, etc. And then in the 1970s, the World Bank, I would say, kind of gradually shifted its mission more towards poverty reduction. And one of the main vehicles for that was rural development with a strong focus on farm productivity, but again, on cereals productivity, really. And if you look, I'm going to click here, if you look at dietary guidelines, like what sort of nutritionists were recommending sort of 50 years ago, this is an example of a food pyramid from Zambia. And it's pretty basic, even the terminology they use staples, relish, which sounds a very antiquated term, and snacks with a bit of fruit. But it says eat plenty of the staple food, right? So people thinking about calories, yeah, okay, eat a mixed diet. They seem to kind of contradict each other if you look in the bottom left there. Include in your diet indigenous foods, etc. Okay, but sort of pretty basic. But in nutrition and in food security, quite a lot of things have changed. So there's that food pyramid from Zambia 50 years ago on the top left. Now you look at 2021, the Zambia food-based dietary guidelines, and they recommend what's often called a healthy eating plate. And those in this kind of pie chart gives you a rough idea of what nutritionists are advising, a very balanced diet, right? So not so much of the cereals and tubers, but plenty of vegetables, plenty of fruits, and there's a lot more science behind these recommendations. So nutritionists go over these recommendations. What do we need in terms of vegetables? 400 grams a day. What do we need in terms of dairy? Is it a glass? Is it full? Is it 2 glasses, etc.? People really think about these things in quite a bit of detail. And then in other ways, of course, we've changed a lot too. We've got the World Health Organization's child growth standards. There's a lot of focus now on stunting, to some extent on wasting too. There's a lot of focus on diets of young children. So the phrase, the first 1,000 days may be relevant to people. So a lot of stunting emerges by age 2. So it emerges from conception to around age 2. And there's a lot of focus on counseling to improve feeding practices, etc. So nutrition has really developed. Nutrition is a relatively young science, but has really developed very rapidly in the last 30 or 40 years. And in the 1990s and 2000s, nutrition went through a couple of decades of very heavy focus on micronutrients. And now things like protein quality have kind of come back. But yes, nutrition has definitely moved away from such a strong or narrow focus on calorie undernutrition. So this change in paradigm calls for new types of thinking about food security as well as poverty. So as I said, in the 1970s, it was this kind of food shortage paradigm, right? Like famines were still in memory. And of course, in the early 1970s, major famine in Bangladesh and the Horn of Africa. And so it's true that in much of the world in the 1970s, lack of calories was the major problem, right? And if you don't have enough calories, it's almost like, well, you can not worry much about micronutrients or protein quality because calories are, survival, right? Very survival focused. Now we need to shift to a nutritious food paradigm. That means we have to address multiple forms of malnutrition. That's true in all regions, basically. We have to address the double burden, which means that we have to worry about overweight as well as diabetes and other non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease, blood pressure, etc. There's a focus on availability. So it's possible for everyone to eat enough calories. And in fact, there are probably many countries around the world where people are eating enough calories, but not eating a healthy diet, right? A healthy, balanced diet. And that sort of raises the question, well, how many people do lack access to healthy diets? And we've seen this shift in the definition of food security too. So in the 1990s, already by then, it was not possible to still define food security as adequate food supplies at the world level or the national level. And so the famous FAO definition from the World Food Summit in 1996 is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And so a lot of what we're going to do today is definitely address that bit in bold, the nutritious food to meet dietary needs, but actually we're also going to talk about food preferences because preferences have, of course, a very strong tradition in poverty measurement. And now also, I think in the last decade or two, we start to really see a disconnect between poverty measurement and nutritional realities on the ground. I've referred to some of these, but here are some global headcounts from roughly 2021. So the World Bank's low income, $2.15 per day poverty line, World Bank says there's 648 million poor people in the world. That basically uses an energy-based food poverty line. So the $2.15 line, originally comes from $1 a day, and that's an average of, I think, 14 poverty lines from 14 different low and middle income countries, or mostly low income countries. And those countries themselves use an energy standard to define their poverty line. They say, okay, what does it cost in Sri Lanka to buy 2,100 calories a day, right? Using a kind of standard common person's diet. That's kind of how it's done. At the FAO, we have the prevalence of undernourishment, or the hunger measures. They have a range, 702 to 828 million. But once we start looking at more nutritionally oriented measures, micronutrient inadequacy, measured with a lot of error, but people think roughly 2 billion. That's a number that's been bandied about for a long time. And then food insecurity, the FIES is the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. That's asking people about experiences of insecurity. Some estimates say 2.3 billion. This healthy diet that we're talking about, so this project I'm working on, it's on the bottom corner there, Food Prices for Nutrition. They've done the background work for the FAO's annual State of Food Insecurity and Nutrition work, and they come up with the number 3 billion. If you use other metrics, you can get to kind of 2 billion, maybe. So it's a bit sensitive to methods, but at the same time, the scale doesn't matter. 2 to 3 billion people who can't afford a healthy diet, so a huge number. And then if you look at child stunting rates or child or adult micronutrient inadequacies, these are often far in excess of poverty rates. And you can see that in Sri Lanka as well. I just added this slide to sort of contextualize the situation in Sri Lanka. So this is comparing the national poverty rate versus estimates of women's anemia in Sri Lanka. And the poverty rate, the national poverty rate's gone from 47% in 2002, I've just extracted this from the World Bank, to 14% in 2019. Of course, it's gone up a lot during the crisis. But if you look at anemia, it's kind of hardly trended down, right? And it's a much higher level, 35%, right? So 2.5 times higher than the national poverty rate. Now, that is very typical in Asia, especially South Asia, but it would also be true in many African countries, not necessarily anemia, but some other micronutrient deficiency you'll find will be much more prevalent than the national poverty rate, especially in sort of the middle income country categories. So that begs the question to us, is there a better way to measure poverty, starting with nutritionally more meaningful food poverty lines? And yeah, of course, we think the answer is yes. So the first thing we have to do is define a healthy diet, right? And this is a bit contentious, but nutritionists broadly agree. And as I said, in the FAO definition, we focus on that sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences. So what we do is we work with food-based dietary guidelines. So that's basically the food pyramid or food plates I already showed you before. And these are a relatively realistic way for regular people to select nutrient adequate and healthy diets via food groups, right? They're heuristic in the sense, like if you look down the bottom, it's basically breaking up the foods we eat into categories of healthy foods, right? So vegetables, fruits, grains, sometimes called staples, dairy, what are often called protein foods, although I don't personally like that term because protein, meat and fish, these have a lot of micronutrients too. So I think protein foods is a misnomer, but that's what they're often referred to. So it's very easy for people to say, okay, you need to make sure you eat all of these foods several times a day or this many portions. So these diets not only meet nutrient adequacy, they are also protect against diseases. One example could be fruits and vegetables, obviously protect against diseases, but whole grains are also thought to protect against diseases, etc. So there's lots of examples. And these are diets that, because they're designed nationally, they're supposed to be dignified, culturally appropriate, etc. Now, that's not to say when you implement them in practice, you can get unrealistic diets, but we can rule those out to a fair extent. Now, not every country has food-based dietary guidelines, but where they have been elaborated, they are kind of the official policy standard for what constitutes dietary needs. And they can also be used to think about social safety nets, what kind of foods poor people need to avoid malnutrition. And of course, they're used for nutrition education as well. So over the past few years, through this Food Prices for Nutrition project and a previous project with the Gates Foundation and FCDO, we've been working a lot on costing out healthy diets, basically figuring out what does it cost in a country, what's the least cost you can spend in a country to purchase a healthy diet. So in other words, if you went to an average market in any country, how much would it cost to obtain a diet that satisfies that country's national dietary guidelines? And then you can calculate, you can think of this as kind of like a poverty line, right? There's some cost, like $2.15 per day, but maybe it's $3 a day, etc. And you can figure out how many people could not afford this cost if they spent all of their money on food, or if they spent a proportion of their expenditure on food. So this is just an example. This is Benin's dietary guidelines, but you can see these kind of quantities there, even though it's in French. Here, they're actually not just saying how many times a day you should have milk, but they're trying to specify, in grams, how many of these foods should you eat. And they give examples, and there's sort of diversity within food groups. So some of the sort of commonalities across dietary guidelines, firstly, they identify a number of required healthy food groups. So it could be 5 healthy food groups, could be 7. You might be familiar with the Eat Lancet diet, which is a global one. They have more. They have like 10 or 12, getting into things like separating out proteins into fish and chicken, etc. But most countries tend to have 6, 7, 8 sort of food groups, something like that. Then typically they'll say you should have this many portions a day, like this many servings of fruit, vegetables, this many servings of dairy. But they might also specify in grams how many, what you should eat, or a range of grams, or even calories, okay, per day. So calories per day, not just in total, but by food group. So the technical task then is to find out how much the recommended amount of each food group costs, at least costs. So if the Ministry of Health in Sri Lanka says we want you to have, I'm just making this up, I don't remember, 200 milliliters of milk, how much does it cost to have a glass of milk in Sri Lanka? How much does it cost to have the recommended amounts of fruits and vegetables, etc.? So when we construct these least cost healthy diets, the food group proportions stay constant, basically. So you've got these total calories, whatever it is, 2,100 calories, and let's say 50-60% are supposed to come from starchy staples, 15% from vegetables, 10% from fruits, etc. Those stay constant, and we sort of define those as a share of total daily kilocalories. But there's substitutability across food items within group. So you can get your dairy from milk, you can get your dairy from yogurt, you can get your dairy from cheese, etc. So you can substitute within these broad food groups. And then we ask, of course, within food groups, what are the cheapest items, right? Is milk cheaper than cheese, etc.? And so when you have these food groups, like this is oils, and this is nuts and legumes, staples, fruits, vegetables, proteins, you add these all up, and this is going to be the cost of a total diet. And like at a global level, I'm not sure if this is maybe 2017 PPP dollars, on average it's about $3.54. And of course this answer is going to vary by season and market, especially in rural areas. There's seasonality. So these least cost diets set a lower bound, but that doesn't mean that we're selecting foods that are preferred, right? So you can always have issues. You can take India, for example. There are some places where maybe you're saying, okay, rice is the cheapest staple, but that is chapati eating part of India, right? So, we haven't, in this least cost diet, we are not accounting for preferences, right? This is a very kind of nutritional approach to estimating the cost of a healthy diet. So in the SOFI reports, the State of Food Insecurity reports that some of my collaborators worked on, in the first time they did it in sort of 2020, they took 12, I think, or maybe it's a bit less, maybe it's roughly 10 available food-based dietary guidelines where the countries had specified quantities, right? Because you need the specified quantities in order to cost it out. And they also looked at the Eat Lancet healthy diet basket. And they just kind of took a median, a little bit of an uncomfortable approach, but it really doesn't matter. When you look at these costs, they're all kind of between $3 and $4, right? And then you've got the World Bank low-income poverty line, which is $2.15, but that's total poverty, that's not food poverty. So if you say that, okay, you've got to spend 52% of $2.15 on food, then the sort of let's say, implicit food poverty line in the World Bank is $1.12, right? So $1.12 in many countries, yes, that will probably buy you enough calories for the day, but it's nowhere near buying this healthy diet, right? It's about 1/3 the level on average. Okay, so 112 compared to whatever I said, $3.54. So it's about 1/3 the level you actually need. And just to add, we've done national studies, used different kinds of data, used household expenditure data. You always find the same result. These healthy diet poverty lines are a lot higher than the sort of energy-based poverty lines that are typically used. So that gets to our motivation. The kind of basic question here is, do standard poverty metrics poorly reflect nutritional needs? I think you can sort of already guess the answer is yes. And we do this because most poor countries still use a cost of basic needs approach for national poverty lines that estimates food baskets according to a dietary energy standard alone, while reflecting consumption patterns of the poor. So basically, when people are constructing poverty lines, they're saying, okay, how do we get to, let's say, 2,500 calories a day using the diets that people typically eat, okay? So in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, Nepal, okay, we know that people eat rice, we know that people eat fish, etc. We're going to look at dietary patterns and construct this poverty line, but just based on achieving an energy standard. So the problem here is a circularity in logic, because poor households consume poor diets. We all know this, right? They consume lots of starchy staples, very few nutrient-dense foods because they're expensive. So this circular logic emerges where the cost of basic nutritional needs is estimated itself from nutritionally inadequate diets. And because of that, poverty measurement is still very much in a sort of old paradigm of nutrition, just focused on energy. So how do we get beyond energy? Well, there's a well-known paper by the economic historian Bob Allen in the American Economic Review, which argues that, yeah, nutrients are not enough. We should move away from this kind of this sort of preference-oriented approach to an energy standard. And he tries to look at micronutrients, but he's not using dietary guidelines. He's just doing linear programming on nutrient adequacy. So there you can get problems because you can suggest diets that are not realistic. In the work we've been doing, we take an alternative approach, very much focused on dietary guidelines, as I said. And in the SOFI reports, which Herforth and I did the calculations for, they also do this least cost healthy diets. But there's a problem here for economists because neither approach really reflects cultural food norms of the poor, right? So we're not factoring in the poor people's preferences, the foods they actually eat, and are likely to mix together in traditional dishes, etc. And that is also in violation of the kind of social inclusion and preference criteria that's embedded in the food security definition that I showed you before. So our contributions, so we argue that a healthy diet is a basic need. You know, that's a normative argument. It should be thought of as a basic need. Basic nutrition should be a need even for poor people. And a healthy diet, a balanced healthy diet, should replace the energy standard in costing basic needs food poverty lines. Second, a healthy diet can be defined from food-based dietary guidelines, these national policy documents, provided they specify some quantities for food groups, and they can be adjusted to reflect cultural food norms or preferences of the poor. And third, poverty estimates resulting from poverty lines that use that traditional energy-based food basket are likely to be much lower than poverty rates based on these healthy diet food baskets. And also, energy-based food baskets are associated with significant micronutrient deficiencies. In other words, in that when you reach that poverty line, when you switch from being poor to non-poor, at that moment, you're going to be defined as non-poor, but you're going to have micronutrient deficiencies. That's it. Sure. And then we apply these arguments, this example to Myanmar, but for lots of reasons, we expect these results to generalize pretty much to all low and middle income countries. So in short, nutrition as a basic need implies that the world is a lot poorer than we think if we accept that definition, this new definition of poverty. So turning to concepts and methods. So the question in poverty measurement is, how do households achieve a minimum level of well-being? How do we define well-being and how do we quantify it? Yeah, well, in economics, welfare, of course, utility is really defined over commodities, and it's supposed to reflect the preferences of poor or near poor households. When we look back at the cost of basic needs kind of reference utility concept, that is a consumption bundle that allows individuals to, quote, lead a healthy and active life, including fully participating in society. So that's a quote from the late Martin Revallian, who of course wrote many papers on conceptualizing and measuring poverty. So when we look at these different factors, there's preferences. So that's the consumption patterns of poor and near poor households that we observe in household survey data. There's social inclusion criteria, cultural norms and socially necessary consumption, these kind of consumption choices. And then crucially for us, this healthy and active life, okay? So what do we mean by a nutrition standard as well? And then of course, we don't do this in this paper, we also need to define non-food basic needs as well, right? So Bob Allen's paper is very interesting on that front as well. So the poverty line here equals this reference utility consumption bundle evaluated prices faced by poor and near poor households, and that equals the food poverty line and then this non-food allowance, but we're not going to deal with the non-food allowance in this paper. So on rethinking the nutrition standard, as I said, we have this energy-based food poverty line, which refers to food consumption by relatively poor households, evaluated at median prices, and then scaled to meet a dietary energy target, right? That's the traditional cost of basic needs poverty line. Then we have these healthy diet affordability, which is like a poverty line reported in the SOFI reports. And that, of course, is, as I said, is a new method for incorporating a healthy diet nutrition standard, but it doesn't factor in preferences. And here what we're trying to do is use a food poverty line, which refers to a cost of a healthy diet. You might sort of a utility consistent healthy diet. And that goes a bit beyond the sort of food insecurity indicators reported by the FAO, but still reflects this idea of economic access to nutritious food to meet needs for active and healthy lives. And it's still aligned with the food-based dietary guidelines, but we're going to try and incorporate food preferences, as I'll show you in a minute. So here we've got just conceptually the energy-based poverty line food basket, with the nutrition standard being the energy threshold. And then food selection to meet that energy threshold is based on consumption patterns of poor or near poor households. But as I said, these are households that don't have nutritious diets. They consume way too many starchy staples and too few nutrient-dense foods. Then we've got the cost of a healthy diet, which is the approach used in the SOFI report, which is much more nutrition focused, this balanced diet using food group guidelines. And then the food selection is based on least cost foods. So there's no preferences here. We're just literally saying, okay, what's the cheapest starchy staple in this market? What's the cheapest dairy? What's the cheapest protein, cheapest vegetable, cheapest fruit, etc. And what we're trying to do here, and what we call this healthy diet food poverty line, is still incorporate this improved nutrition standard, but also reflect consumption patterns of poor or near poor households. But we're not going to do it for the whole diet. We're going to do it within food groups, right? So we're going to say, to be healthy, you have to consume this amount of fruits, but we're going to say, okay, what are the fruits that poor people consume, right? So they're not going to be consuming lychees or, you know, imported apples from Australia. They're probably going to be consuming bananas or some other local fruit, right? So that's how we're sort of blending the nutritional criteria from here with the important utility consistency and kind of preference consistency approach that's been used by economists for a long time. So just reiterating that the food groups in this new healthy diet food poverty line are scaled to meet the food group quantities specified in the dietary guidelines. The relative shares of foods within each food group are fixed, right? So people sort of in this poverty line, the consumption bundle has to meet the food group specific recommendations of the dietary guidelines. And then the total food basket is scaled to meet the dietary energy target. So we're still meeting an energy target, right? And then the healthy diet poverty line is just going to be the healthy diet food poverty line plus this cost of basic needs non-food allowance that we're not addressing in this paper, but we have looked at in some other work. So being classified as non-poor in terms of a healthy diet poverty line is distinct from actually consuming a healthy diet. This is important. So just because people can afford a healthy diet doesn't mean they purchase a healthy diet. We know that. So going back to the sort of economic component of this criteria, we're trying to estimate here utility consistent regional poverty lines. So this is important in lots of countries. In Myanmar, it's especially important. Myanmar is a very, very diverse country, lots of different ethnic groups, etc. And within the estimation of food poverty lines in the traditional economic approach, there's a real tension between two principles in estimating poverty lines. So one is utility consistency, which states that poverty lines should represent the same reference utility level across time and space. So we want to make those comparisons consistent, but then there's specificity as well. And that's the idea that poverty lines should also reflect local conditions, including relative prices, which can vary within countries, but also food availability and cultural norms, etc. So my co-author Channing, in a previous paper with Simla, they developed methods for estimating utility consistent regional poverty lines. So they first estimate regional food poverty lines based on regional consumption patterns and nutrition targets. Then they use revealed preference theory. They identify inconsistencies in utility levels across regions by testing revealed preference conditions. And they use this cross-entropy criteria, which enforces revealed preference constraints while preserving as much as possible the information content of the initial food poverty baskets. So attaining utility consistency via revealed preference conditions has greater flexibility than the use of price indices. And that implies an ability to incorporate additional constraints, such as a healthy diet basket nutrition standard. So turning to the data we use, as I said, this is a Myanmar case study. We use a 2015 survey implemented by the government and the World Bank. It's nationally representative and it's pretty standard, LSMS type survey. It uses a 7-day recall of quite a long food list, 154 food items. We split it up into 5 subnational poverty line regions. The sample, unfortunately, was too small to go more disaggregated than that, but still, for demonstration purposes, I think it's okay. And then the nutrition standard here is 2,195 kilocalories per adult woman equivalent. Of course, we adjust that for sort of household size and the demographic composition of households. And then the dietary guidelines we're using here have 7 healthy diet food groups, plus a little bit of an allowance for discretionary foods like sugars. And so if you look at these dietary guidelines, in gram terms, it's about 330 grams of starchy staples, some pulses, 100 grams of meat, fish, eggs, 225 grams of dairy, and then vegetables, they actually split up further into 2 types, dark green leafy vegetables, very healthy, and then other vegetables, and quite a large contribution here. So you look at this healthy diet, 450 grams from vegetables, so more grams from vegetables even than starchy staples, 200 grams of fruits, 30 grams of fats, and then this discretionary food allowance. So turning to results, I think this is a very dramatic illustration of what I was talking about earlier, that poor people consume poor diets, right? So if we look at these food baskets, this is the traditional energy-based food basket for the food poverty line, which basically just says meet the calories and do it with the prevailing consumption patterns within the country for poor and near poor households. Well, no surprise, in Myanmar and throughout Asia, poor people get huge amounts of calories from starchy staples, about 73% here, but that's very typical. I'm not sure what the level is in Sri Lanka. Even though Sri Lanka's richer than Myanmar, it would still be pretty high. And then you look at the rest of the diet, quite high consumption of fats and oils. Why is this? Fats and oils are very cheap sources of calories. Right? And then you have discretionary foods quite high. Sugar is also a good source of calories. And then quite low consumption of pulses, very low consumption of meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, dairy, and fruit. So that's basically, but being able to buy this basket gets you out of food poverty, but you're not going to have a healthy body consuming this diet, right? And then looking at this diet, this is the healthy diet. About 54% of calories come from starchy staples, and then a lot of balance, right? A much larger slice for pulses, meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, fruits, fats about the same. And this is what I was referring to earlier when you switch from being poor to non-poor, what do you see in terms of micronutrient deficiencies? So here we're using the EARs, the nutrient intake that satisfies the needs of half the healthy individuals in a specified age gender group. And we're specifically looking at the percentage of EARs that are satisfied from these diets for a 30-year-old woman for these, well, protein, but then a bunch of different important micronutrients. So it might be a little bit hard to read, but red is bad. And no surprise for the energy-based diet, I can just read this. On average, 48% of calcium requirements are achieved from the energy-based diet. So you're going to have calcium deficiency, you're going to have some magnesium deficiency, some zinc deficiency, very important nutrient, pretty large deficiencies of vitamin C, thiamine, riboflavin, very important micronutrient, huge deficiency there. B6 is almost there, and folate, another very important nutrient. B12, also very, very important. Vitamin A, very important. So these are huge deficiencies for very important micronutrients. When you look at the healthy diet, the only deficiency is for riboflavin. Now, that can happen. Healthy diets are not necessarily guaranteed to achieve adequacy in all micronutrients, because you're selecting particular foods and then they can combine in ways that don't necessarily close micronutrient gaps. So in summary, a person can become non-poor by crossing over this traditional poverty line and still have very serious micronutrient deficiencies. When we just look at the food basket cost, so this is in 2011 purchasing power parity dollars per day. So the energy-based poverty line is about $1.83. Remember the World Bank poverty line back then was $1.90, but that was total poverty, not just food poverty. So the energy-based poverty line is still quite higher than the sort of implicit World Bank poverty line. When we look at this kind of healthy diet quasi-poverty line that is used by the State of Food Insecurity and in several papers we've done in this project, that gets you up to about $2.35. That's quite a bit, but this doesn't incorporate preferences or the food consumption patterns of the poor. Once you incorporate those preferences and impose sort of utility consistency, this goes up again quite a lot, $3.30. And that's, you know, something like very close to the middle income poverty line that the World Bank uses, but that's the total poverty line, not the food poverty line. So you can see that, you know, maybe the middle income poverty line, the World Bank might be something like $2 a day, and this is already $3.30 a day. Right? And when you look at the costs here, this I should say costs by food groups, you can kind of ignore starchy staples. When you look at the energy-based standard, the costs, of course, are very low for pulses, meat, dairy, etc., because there's no nutritional standard imposed for these brown bars, right? It's just about calories and the consumption patterns of poor people with poor diets. When you look at the healthy diet, of course, this goes up. These costs go up quite a lot. And also what's interesting, when you impose preferences, they go up even more. So an interesting example from Myanmar, for example, is like, unlike here, they don't really eat dal. They eat very little nuts and legumes, except a bit in salads. For them, protein means fish, chicken, eggs, etc. Right. So preferences matter a lot, actually, when it comes to these things, and the same is somewhat true of vegetables as well. So when you do poverty comparisons, of course, no surprise, if you increase the poverty line, more people are going to be classified as poor. But what's interesting is the size of the effect, right, of switching from an energy standard to a kind of healthy diet nutrition standard. In Myanmar, the national poverty rate goes from 20% to 48%. You see this big jump in rural and urban areas, but it's over 4 times larger in urban areas. And then the same kind of story in terms of depth of poverty. And I think the next graph kind of illustrates what's going on here. This is the expenditure distribution per adult equivalent, right? And then you impose 2 different poverty lines. The energy-based total poverty line, so that's food and non-food, is $3.16, but the healthy diet total poverty line is $4.69. So once you allow for the non-food expenditure line as well, you see this big shift. So all these people between these 2 lines are now classified as poor if you switch to a complete nutrition standard. So in conclusions, the energy-based standard typically used to define food poverty lines results in a basket severely deficient in most essential nutrients or micronutrients, and relative to a healthy diet standard, it undercounts the share of the population unable to meet basic needs. In contrast, the healthy diet standard generally meets the nutrient needs whilst aligning with the foods typically consumed by poor or near poor people. It satisfies the long-standing aim of the cost of basic needs approach as a standard within which it is possible for people to lead a healthy and active life, including fully participating in the society. It still follows the cost of basic needs use of consumption patterns, so we don't depart from that, right? We keep that, and that's quite different from Bob Allen's approach, where he just uses linear programming so that he chucks out preferences and just says, okay, what's the cheapest way to close all these micronutrient gaps, irrespective of whether the diet is realistic or preferred by poor people or consistent with their consumption patterns. And in countries with national food-based dietary guidelines, such as Sri Lanka, this approach aligns with an established national policy, right? Because the Ministry of Health is saying, in Sri Lanka, this is what we recommend people to eat to be healthy. And it also aligns with internationally recognized food security definitions, particularly the definition adopted by the FAO of the cost of a healthy diet. So some discussion, feasibility. The healthy diet food poverty line methodology is reasonably straightforward to implement, or let's say not much more complicated than the approaches already used. It can be implemented using a single national food bundle or the utility consistent regional approach that we use in this paper to allow for the diversity that is often present within countries. Some limitations: would people shift consumption to different items if they were trying to limit costs? It's sort of an interesting extension, I think. And then furthermore, in terms of implications, the key takeaways are that many more people should be counted as poor under this, in our view, nutritionally sensible food poverty line. Using the healthy diet poverty line also helps to explain the large disconnect that we see between poverty and malnutrition rates. And of course, affordability is just one barrier. Availability, accessibility, desirability, they're also driving factors in diets. So we're not saying that affordability is the sole constraint. But if people cannot afford a healthy diet, it's difficult to argue that their basic needs are met. And then finally, nutritionally sensible poverty lines may also help foster better multi-sectoral strategies for simultaneously addressing poverty and nutrition. So a good example is social protection, right? It's not enough to just give people just enough money to buy calories. You're not going to address the problems of malnutrition in a country if you're just handing out rice, etc. And that can also provide a common ground metric for economics and nutrition. So just a final note on Sri Lanka. Of course, this is applicable in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has its food-based dietary guidelines recently updated. And one study by a colleague of mine, Quinn Marshall, has already done this during his PhD, and now he's also working with Hardy data. I'll show you in a minute. But these, for example, are some of the recommendations from Sri Lanka's food-based dietary guidelines. There's nothing very unusual in these. These are pretty similar across countries. What tends to differ across countries is how much specificity there is in quantifying, grams per day for different food groups, or how much diversity there is within food groups. For example, they say eat at least 2 vegetables, 1 green leafy vegetable, and also 2 fruits daily. These kind of things can vary a little bit. But basically, food-based dietary guidelines have a lot of commonalities across countries. And then my colleague has been using Harty's food price data and updated only to May 2022, but obviously this period of very high food inflation. And in fact, these are also, this is the change in the cost of a healthy diet in real terms. So this is above and beyond non-food inflation, which is very, very high, of course. And you see that the cost of a healthy diet has risen by 30% in real terms. And also, I think what's striking here for Sri Lanka, but very typical, is that 75% of the total recommended diet cost consists of non-staple foods. So in Sri Lanka, like other Asian countries, policy talks about rice a lot. And that's understandable because people get very angry if they don't have enough rice in any Asian country. But the nutritional challenge is not just rice, right? Even though the cost of rice has gone up, most of this cost is non-rice foods from a nutritional point of view. So that's my last slide. I mean, there are always challenges. In any country, statistical agencies don't like to change the way they measure poverty. It's very politically contentious and controversial. And nobody likes to increase the poverty rate, right? So no government wants to see the poverty rate double because of some nerdy economist deciding he doesn't like the way they did their poverty line, right? But at the same time, I think there's opportunities, particularly outside of government, to sort of redo this kind of work, to kind of close the disconnect between poverty and nutrition. I showed you that graph on Sri Lanka. And also to generate indicators that an alternative indicator that is acceptable to nutritionists because they develop these healthy diet standards. You know, the Ministry of Health in Sri Lanka developed this, and it should be acceptable to economists because we still use utility theory that economists developed. And I think from an agriculture point of view, it's also useful because in ministries of agriculture, they work within food groups, right? They work within sectors. Okay, thank you. So there's a discussion paper there and also many other references. But yeah, I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hedy. Ladies and gentlemen, I felt extremely happy listening to him because I'm close to a very close-minded person in terms of what you presented. In fact, in 2008, when we had this food crisis, the world food crisis, in which food prices increased by about 300%, we started a research program on food security. So this is a book chapter that I published along with my students and colleagues: Impact of Food Prices, Income Distribution, and Food Security in Oman. Now, in this work, we did exactly the same that you mentioned here. That's why I said we are so close. Exactly the same that you did here, using an operations research model, of course. So, in which we estimated what we refer to here, NAP-LCD, nutritionally adequate, least cost, preferred diet. Now, you were always challenging, saying that including the preferences would be the most difficult. Yes, it is the most difficult, but in our work here, we have shown that it is possible. How it is done, we will discuss once we give opportunity to the rest and when we come back to the discussion. But that is the most important in terms of measuring food security, because as you kept on saying, if you go by this calorie requirement, it is like human beings could even eat grass and still meet this requirement. So we being human, what's most important is that we should have the freedom of choice. That is, we should be able to choose what we prefer. That is human dignity. So to any number that we estimate, that human sentiment should get included. So I was a bit disappointed when you keep on saying that the preferences could not be included. We have done it, but just initiated doing it. We can discuss about it later. So I'll give this book chapter to you. This may not be the proper print. You can get it from ResearchGate. Then we also did a study. This is mostly operational research work. We did some econometric work where we looked at the impact of the changes in food prices on the producers and consumers, consumer surplus approach. So this has also that estimate that's there. Then this is another piece of work where we did food security as a public good. Often people argue that government should not support food production, particularly with this fertilizer issue in Sri Lanka. They say subsidizing fertilizer is a silly thing. Let me say in the right language, is a silly thing. But when the food crisis happened, even rich countries like Oman, they have a flood of money, but they couldn't import the basic need of rice. The Sultan of Oman called us at the university and asked for solutions. So we worked on that to bring back wheat production, which might sound silly, but still, in times of crisis, even if you beg, there isn't food. That was the situation in that country where I lived at that time. So we worked on this concept, and in this paper we have argued that it's a public good, because that was the time when the whole region was in a crisis, which turned over to a political crisis. Yeah, so that was the time. So it is so important. So here we have argued why public support is required for food security. This is again in 2005. There was another food crisis, a smaller cycle, which was influenced by the changes in fuel prices. So much so that even in Oman, which is oil rich, but not that rich as Saudi Arabia, they had to sort of ration, not ration, but sort of, it's a sort of word, that take certain steps. And they increased the fuel prices though they had so much of fuel, but that impacted the poor. So here we have done a simulation study to estimate the impact of changes in fuel and food prices on poverty. And by the way, in Oman, poverty and food security are measured by one and the same measure, as you said. So they define poverty and food security in terms of those who spend more than 60% of their household income as being poverty and food insecure. They're not two things. They are one. Food is poverty.
Just a share.
Yes, just a share. Then this is about a study that we did on food waste. Now we talk a lot about production, we talk a lot about consumption, but in these countries particularly, they are so rich that they waste about 30% of the food from plate to mouth. So in order to at least shake them, we did this work and showed them that. So this is to share with you what we have, with gratitude to what you shared with us now. And I have few questions to ask you or to discuss with you, to which I will come later. But I would like to open the forum to you all of you are first.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hadi. That was very interesting. So thanks a lot again, and hope to see you at the next research, reflection, and practices lecture. Thank you all.